Hello, folks. Welcome to the virtual barn exhibit. I'll be your host today. I'm Dr. Scott Williams. I'm in the Department of Forestry and Horticulture here at the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station. I'm going to be talking to you about healthy forests and healthy people, how the health of our forests is directly linked to the health of our forest-dwelling public. Here in Connecticut, we're heavily forested, and we are forest-dwelling people. We live in the forests and we interact with the wildlife and trees in those forests, and also some of the pests that come with those in those forests. So I'm going to talk to you a bit today about various health aspects of the forests and how the public can benefit from healthy forests and healthy forest management, and how we have a responsibility to keep the forests healthy, and it's our best interest, our health interest, to do so. So forest health can be defined in many different ways. In the next few slides, I'm going to show you some of what we mean here. In this slide, you can see kind of your classic Connecticut fairly mature forest, and all the trees are basically the same age. There's no smaller, younger trees to take over once these trees mature and die off. This is in part due to canopy closure, where the sunlight can't penetrate through to the forest floor, and if stuff does regenerate, oftentimes we have overabundant deer that come through and consume a lot of that regeneration. In a forest that you see here, we have increased fern cover, which tends to be a product of overabundant deer as well. And as you can see throughout this slide here, the ferns are covering the forest floor, and they're gobbling up the sunlight that's coming through this thin stand, and in doing so they're blocking sunlight from some of the beneficial tree regenerative species from absorbing that sunlight and photosynthesizing it and getting up into the upper canopy. So this is just an example of interfering vegetation, stifling regeneration. In this case, it's native ferns. But we can also deal with situations where we have invasive plants doing the same thing. This is a very dramatic slide, as are all of these slides I'm about to show you. This is Japanese stilt grass. This is obviously an invasive grass from Japan that can really take over disturbed habitats that are prone to flooding and so forth. This one happens to be on the banks of the Connecticut River. But you can see the trees are pretty mature in this forest stand, and you can see a carpet of this Japanese stilt grass, and all you can see is a monoculture of that stilt grass with no native regeneration occurring. Similarly, this is an invasive shrub that we've worked with for over the past decade or so. This is in Lyme, Connecticut, and this is a forest infested with Japanese barberry. So similar to the ferns and the Japanese stilt grass, this barberry is a shrub that gobbles up all the sunlight that's coming down and really stifles native regeneration through coming through the sunlight, coming through the upper canopy here onto the forest floor. So you can see my colleague JP here standing in the background, but you can also see a lot of the trees are overly mature and we're not getting any smaller regeneration. So the age class is very on the high age class. There's not much young trees coming through. And in this case, some forests are overabundant with white-tailed deer, as is the case in this photograph. And as you can imagine, with too many deer come big appetites and calorie requirements, and they can consume a lot of native regeneration. So if we have too many deer, the forests are going to be in poor health, and deer also are host to black-legged ticks, which pose a threat to human health through disease and so forth, which is kind of the crux of this presentation here. And in this instance here, we have a combination of these. We have even-aged stand, where all the trees are fairly mature. We have impacts from deer browsing, as you can see with the open landscape on the bottom. You can see over 100 yards through the woods, and we have the beginnings of an invasive plant infestation over here, and over here we have Japanese barberry getting established down here, and some spotty ones here. And over time, this is going to spread throughout this entire forest floor and stifle whatever regeneration is coming through. So I've mentioned Japanese barberry on a few occasions, and that's because we've done a lot of work with barberry in terms of stifling native regeneration, but also in tick abundance. And in this chart here, you can see that forests invaded with Japanese barberry. We found that there were 120 black-legged or deer ticks per acre in those forests, and forests without barberry only had about 10 ticks per acre. So a pretty dramatic impact of this invasive shrub taking over the landscape, and this happens because the barberry retains humidity, which the ticks require to survive. So in a barberry dominated forest, it's much more humid, and therefore you have much more tick survival. So, and this is a case with many invasive plants that grow in dense mats that retain humidity throughout the day, and similar situations can arise. And it's not just the Japanese barberry plant alone that does this. And then we went from our woodland sites where we're seeing even age stands, older mature forests, barberry infested forests, invasive infested forests. We looked at the residential landscape, and whereas you have more monotypic habitats in the forested areas and residential areas, we see increased habitat diversity. Like in this slide here, we see the lawn, we see in the foreground some shrubs planted, some mulch, we see some flowers over to the right, we see an edge habitat, which wildlife species like, in the back, and then further back we have forested habitat. So this is a variety of habitats in people's backyards that people maintain that have a tendency to benefit a wide array of wildlife species. And we did some research into this, comparing the habitats of the residential areas to the mature woodland areas, and we found some differences which were kind of interesting. We found that there were more wildlife diversity in people's backyards than there were in the mature forest, and that is a result of that habitat diversity. So host species richness is just the number of species we saw in residential versus woodland habitats, and this is standardized, and the letters here mean significant difference. If the letters differ, the two values are significantly different. So we found more species in residential areas than we did in the woodlands. And these pictures on the right indicate some of the highlights. We had multiple bobcats in people's backyards, red foxes, white-tailed deer fawns, coyotes, a whole host of others. And in residential forests, we also found an increased abundance of wildlife, not only diversity, but abundance. So in residential areas, we had 2.4 images encounters with wildlife per trap night that we had these cameras out, as opposed to only 0.9 encounters per trap night in the woodland habitat. So almost 3 times as many encounters with various species of wildlife in the residential areas as opposed to these mature woodland forests. So this is just more proof that wildlife prefer the habitat diversity in people's backyards over the mature forests. And as a result of that, because we have more hosts in residential areas, the ticks there have a wider array of hosts to feed upon. So the mice that we've captured, which are the reservoir for the various pathogens, where the ticks feed on the mice and uptake the pathogens, and then can infect you or me or our pets or our children, there were much fewer in residential. There were 2.5 times fewer per mouse. So in residential areas, there was only approximately 1 tick feeding on mice, versus in woodland settings where there are fewer hosts, were approximately 2.4 ticks per mouse feeding. So as I mentioned, 2.5 times more ticks per mouse in residential settings because there are fewer wildlife hosts. So ticks are prioritizing their meals on the mice, which are the reservoirs for the various pathogens that can get us sick. So something that you can do to help the health of yourself and your family, and also for your family's enjoyment, is you could make your backyard wildlife habitat by different plantings and different habitats and so forth. And if you You can go to this website here if you want to learn more about that, and you can even get your backyard certified. But this benefits the health of the wildlife species, brings in more wildlife that is not only nice to see in your backyard, but also dilutes these ticks and these pathogens and has the potential to reduce disease transfer in your backyard. So for more information, you can go to this website on this slide here. So generally, we're finding more ticks and more risk of disease in these unhealthy forested habitats, whether it be Barbary infested, whether it be other invasives, whether it be too many deer. So that's just kind of what we were seeing. We wanted to further this and kind of get a better grasp of what these different habitats had in common and if we were seeing fewer ticks in healthier forests. So we got a grant from the CDC to do a statewide active tick surveillance program in which we had 5 locations in each of Connecticut's 8 counties that we are currently sampling ticks from. So this gave us a great opportunity to look at the various habitats and look at tick densities in these locations and compare and contrast them. So I mentioned there were 5 locations in each of the 8 counties, and in 2019 we sampled each area at each location 6 to 8 times throughout the season, and we sampled the same area at each spot so we could compare the density and infection. And this was a great collaboration with state parks, state forests, land trusts, municipal parks, and all these are publicly accessible, so the public has the opportunity to go there to recreate and also potentially pull up get a tick on them. And these are all forested areas. So this one, for instance, is Black Rock State Park in Watertown, Connecticut. This is an example of where we would sample, and in these images, well, it's just a snapshot of a portion of the forest. You can see it's relatively healthy. We have light coming through, we have some mature trees, we have younger trees, we have some ground cover, some light penetration, and through 2019 we only found about 1 nymphal black-legged tick per 1,000 square meters and 1 adult tick per 1,000 square meters on each visit. So this is an example of a healthy forest with low tick abundance. Another one was Tobias and Memorial Forest. This was Joshua's Land Trust in Tallinn, Connecticut. Again, you can see the forest is healthy. You have pretty dense vegetation, some down trees, some light gaps forming in the right-hand image here, some ground cover. So just forest in generally good health, it looks like, with few deer. And we had 2.2 nymphal black-legged ticks per 1,000 square meters and 1.3 adults per visit. So again, very low chances of getting a tick on you and therefore getting sick. Another one was Gay City State Park in Hebron, Connecticut. And all these forests that are in better health seem to be in the northern part of the state, where typically deer abundances are lower. But again, this is off the trail that we sample, and on the left or right of the trail you can see some dense vegetation. We can see the trees, we've got some good canopy overhead, and here we found 1.3 nymphs and 1 adult per 1,000 square meters for every time we went to sample. And now we're getting into some poorer quality habitats. This is an example of at the Kellogg Environmental Center, which is in Derby, Connecticut. You can see some very dense canopy, and then on this field edge you see some heavy invasive cover. This is the dense vegetation that I was talking about previously, and here we found 3.8 nymphs and 8 adults per 1,000 square meters when we sampled. So pretty dramatic increase from those forest interiors that were in a healthy stand. This one was curious. This is Housatonic Meadow State Park in Sharon, Connecticut. This is a fairly healthy forest, but we had very high tick abundances here. But if you look at the images, it contrasts to the others where you can see through the forest quite a ways, and you have some minimal ground cover and not as much shrub cover. And like I said, mature stands, not a lot of light penetration. So our guess here is that we have increased deer abundance with all these adults. So we have 7.7 nymphs per 1,000 square meters and 12.7 adults per 1,000 square meters. So we're not quite sure, but we're clearly seeing something with the habitat here as opposed to the other locations. And we want to quantify this and try to figure. And here we have the University of Connecticut forest up in Storrs, Connecticut, in the northeast corner of the state. On the left-hand side, you can see this path that leads down to a trail system that cuts into the woods here. And then in the middle slide, we can see a fairly mature stand, the closed canopy with not much light penetrating. And then some of the light gaps here in the foreground. What do we see? We see Japanese barberry here. We see barberry here. And in the background over here, this is barberry. This is all dominated by barberry. Same over here. All these clumps are invasive Japanese barberry that we know are a magnet for ticks. So this forest stand isn't in the greatest of health. It's invasive dominated, and we're seeing, not surprisingly, an increased number of ticks. So 14.5 nymphal black-legged ticks per 1,000 square meters and 9.3 adults per 1,000 square meters. So we're seeing differences in tick abundances at all these different sites all over the states. And those in poor health, by our eye, we're seeing increased tick abundances, and those in better health, we're seeing fewer tick abundances, with some exceptions here and there, obviously. So this year we're in the process of trying to quantify the habitats in terms of tree diversity, plant diversity, tree age, stand age, deer abundance, invasive abundance, and trying to quantify all that and look at tick abundances on top of that. So we're pretty certain that when the forests that are in good and healthy by all our metrics will have a lower abundance of ticks and are better for humans that are found within there, and those forests that are unhealthy will have a higher abundance of ticks. So we're hoping that folks use our research to better manage forests, get rid of the invasive plants, do some proper age stand management, and hopefully that'll increase wildlife populations, and that will really reduce tick abundances, leading to a better enjoyment of the forests and not as much worry and better health of the Connecticut public. Well, that concludes my virtual barn exhibit presentation, and I hope you learned something. If you should feel the need to contact me with any comments or questions or clarifications, please do so. I'm great on email. You can reach me at scott.williams@ct.gov. Otherwise, you can give me a call at 203-974-8609. I hope you learned something today, and I want to thank you for your time and hope to see you next year at Plant Science Day. Thank you.